Hi, I'm Sleep Aid, your local sleep paralysis demon, and today we are taking a look at Polaris Sui Generis by Meowmalet 101. And if you would like to submit your own webtoon for review, you can do so on the Reddit post, which is linked in the description. So, let's go ahead and take a look at this one. It is a sci-fi action series. I'll read the description and then we will discuss it. It says, "Nobody knows what happened to our planet. Nobody knows its true name or who built the planet-sized vast mechanical shell upon its surface. Only the apotheozed operators, humans enhanced by mysterious bioengineering technology excavated from the shell, can survive the cold and desolate surface world. And now, one young man, blessed by this power, must traverse this wasteland to deliver his most important cargo to one of the last bastions of humanity." So, the word I would use to describe this series is bleak. It is a very bleak story about a desolate world, and even the first 3 episodes are a flash forward of sorts, because after the first 3 we go back 10 days, and starting out there are only 2 characters, and so then when we flash backward we are introduced to a lot more characters who presumably don't survive. And so it is a dire situation that we are following these people through, and generally I like that type of story very much, where there's a nearly futile mission to try and accomplish, and characters are dropping left and right in horrible and unpredictable ways, and it's not clear if anyone will make it out alive or if there will even be a point to doing so by the time all is said and done. And so, as a horror fan, I quite enjoy that atmosphere in any given story, so that was something immediately that I liked about this one a lot. As far as reviewing it goes, I'm going to structure things a little bit differently because the author did have some specific questions that they'd wanted answered as far as the review goes, and so I'll start by addressing those, and then I'll get into my general thoughts and bring up anything that maybe didn't get mentioned. So the first question was, is the world building good and interesting, and is it paced well? Is the information being doled out in a way that's easy to understand and at a good pace? And so I would say that I think that it's mostly well done. And so this is the type of story where it throws you into a very, very foreign world that has different rules and different systems for how it operates. And rather than just dumping all of that on top of the reader immediately with massive exposition, it's kind of doled out slowly, naturally in conversation. And so immediately you can tell that the characters are speaking in a lot of terms that you don't necessarily understand, and they're referring to things that you don't necessarily know about yet, but it's presented confidently and in a way that kind of implies that you're going to get those explanations as time goes on when they are necessary to be gotten, and for the most part that is how it plays out. And so you're slowly introduced to these strange terms and these strange things happening, and then as is necessary it gets explained. And so I think that generally that is fine, because again, the way it is presented, I feel that it does come off as though you're going to get the answers to your questions when you need to get them, when is most convenient for the story, and when it will be most necessary to know them. I do feel, though, that I had a few maybe obvious questions that I think didn't really get addressed right away, and so some of it was in the description, with the setup of the world being that no one really knows why the planet is covered in machines, or even what the history of the planet is. They're just adapting to the situation that the few remaining humans have found themselves in. And so some of these things are probably not going to get resolved until, I would imagine, the very end of the series, if they get addressed at all. It could be something that's just not even relevant to the actual story, but I do feel that the base story as it's presented is our main character, Nexian. I want to make sure I got the name right. I'm very bad at remembering names. Yep, there it is, Nexian. So Nexian is tasked with the mission of delivering his friend Shun, who is a special type of cyborg human, apotheope, that has the ability to bring him back from the dead, and presumably others as well. And so the thrust of the narrative is that Nexian has to get Shun from the outpost that we start in to the Polaris, which is a fortress that crawls across the surface of the planet at a fixed interval. And that is essentially the whole plot, except the robot planet is undergoing earthquakes, which is stirring up the robots and causing them to kind of interfere with that mission. And so, for the most part, the major questions are answered. What is an apotheope? How do the powers work that these characters have? How does the regeneration work? All of that stuff largely gets addressed, and for the most part pretty quickly, so you're not really left wondering anything that's too important for too long. But I did have a few things that I felt like maybe didn't get addressed, or I just missed them. But again, a majority of our comic up to this point is spent around the outpost, which is where we start out here, and this is one place where I feel that the world building could probably be paced a little bit slower to help give us a better idea of our setting and kind of what's going on here and why we're here. And so we don't really know a lot about what is going on at the outpost here, why these characters are even stationed at this outpost, and essentially what their goals are before things go wrong. Because things going wrong is what starts the narrative really moving. But we know that our main characters are meant to protect this other special character, and their primary mission is to get that person to the Polaris, but it isn't really clear why such a valuable piece of cargo is stashed at this outpost in the first place. And so I feel like that doesn't really get addressed. I'm not sure if it is important necessarily, but it was a kind of an open-ended question that I felt I was left with. And then on the topic of slowing down the pacing of the world building, there was, I feel, a bit of a missed opportunity near the beginning of the comic to kind of explain what the outpost was, to kind of give an overview of the outpost, what life was like here, how many people were actually living here, what they were doing, and a little bit more of that day-to-day. That way we could kind of understand what it meant when it was lost. Because pretty early in the story, essentially once we go back to the flashback, this is where the story begins. And so we have our characters. They're protecting the precious cargo, which is Shun in a cryostasis pod, and an earthquake destroys a majority of the outpost immediately, and the few remaining survivors gather together to try and make a last-ditch attempt to cross the planet and reach the crawling fortress. But it kind of kicks off really, really quickly at a time where we don't really know what the outpost is or very much about it at all. And so it feels like we're moving on a little too quickly. And I just think that learning a little bit more about the outpost, about what people were doing there, how they were living there, and kind of what was going on there in general would help establish the stakes a little bit better going into the beginning of the conflict, which is everything being destroyed and the survivors deciding to try and make the journey. And so there are just little things like that I think maybe could have been dwelled on a little bit more, but it's kind of at a point now where it doesn't really matter at this stage in the narrative, because by now, 30 episodes later, the outpost is kind of just a distant memory, and so the chance to really kind of set it up and explain it is already long gone by. But that was just one thing, as specifically on the topic of world building, that I felt like was maybe missing. As far as the pacing of the world building, though, other than that, I feel like everything generally works. Like I said, information is doled out kind of slowly, but it's also kind of methodical, and it's given as is necessary. And so there are little things that are foreshadowed that get explained later, and it's clear that it's not just being made up all in one go. I mean, or it's not just being made up week by week. It's a lot of it has been predetermined. It's been planned out, and so I think that that honestly becomes evident, because this style of revealing information doesn't really work if there's not a plan, which is having characters acting confidently in a certain way, and then the viewer being told later kind of why they're acting that way and like what exactly is going on. And so it is clear that there is a plan here, that there's quite a bit of obviously world building done ahead of time, and so I think for the most part, for me, it worked. And the few questions that I had were kind of minor things that seem like they might just not be that important to the actual context of the story itself. And so, yeah, I would say that the world building is mostly well done. Now, the second question was specifically, is the pacing in the second arc good? And the second arc is the last 7 or 8 episodes, and so that's obviously much further in, but specifically the pacing on those episodes, I think so far is fine. I do feel that there's really only one thing that I think is dwelled on a little bit too long, which is the energy sickness or radiation poisoning or whatever you want to call it. But I feel like it is a little bit overly explained, and so there's maybe a few more panels talking about that than it really needed, but that's a minor thing. I don't think it's like hurting the overall pacing much, and I think that for the most part, I mean, the characters are clearly moving through space, they're continuing on this journey, and so it feels like things are progressing because they're moving between areas, and so there's a visual difference in between each scene, which kind of gives that sense of progression. And so I think that the pacing in the latter half is fine so far, but I also can't really judge it very much based off of the only 7 or 8 episodes that we have at this point, because it kind of depends on how long the series is supposed to be. So if the whole thing is going to be wrapped up really quickly in 50 episodes or less, then it would feel like the pacing was too slow, like we were dwelling on things that didn't matter. But if it's intended to be longer than that, then the pacing is just fine as it is. I don't feel like it's dragging on, and I also don't feel like it's necessarily going too quickly. I think it seems pretty deliberate. And it's also still taking the time, even in the later episodes, to kind of explain more things about the world and kind of give us more information about what's actually going on. So I thought it was mostly fine. I didn't feel that the pacing stood out in a positive or a negative way for the latest episodes. And then the final specific question was, do the long vertical panels work? Essentially, is the usage of so many really, really long vertical panels interrupting the flow or making it hard to follow in any way? Are they working out as intended? And for the most part, I would say yes. I would say it's probably about an 80% hit rate with the vertical panels, whereas 20% of the time it misses. But I do like that some of the scenes, especially the more action-oriented scenes, because it's a very lateral story. I mean, even the depth is in the title of each episode. And so this is a story that takes place over a series of, varying heights, because they are moving deeper or more shallow through the core of the planet, the surface of the planet. And so kind of the lateral movement of the characters through the physical space is actually very important to this story. And so I think the vertical panels kind of help to portray that when they're in those moments of, moving across the space. And so I think they mostly work. There are a few places in some of the action scenes where it's a little bit confusing when they transition from one really big vertical panel to another really big vertical panel. Sometimes it can be a little bit jarring, just depending on what actual motion is being portrayed, but I think a majority of the time it worked just fine. And so it seems like it's overall not something to really be concerned about. One thing that did stand out to me, though, about particularly some of the larger panels, and this is just a note on the art itself, I guess, it just in general, but like I said, this is a very lateral story. It deals with height and depth quite a lot, and there are a lot of moments where characters are looking up or looking down across that laterality, and because of the way that the backgrounds are shaded, it can kind of feel flat sometimes, to where you don't really get a good sense of that verticality. And so I think that maybe looking at ways to break up the foreground from the background and the distance a little bit better would kind of help to really give a sense of scale, because there are so many moments where we're looking down long elevator shafts or, these massive chasms, and there's a sort of flatness to some of the environments to where I don't think it conveys the scale as well as it could. And so that's something that I would suggest changing in some way. It's, let's see, we might be able to find an example here soon. There was a particular one in one of the upcoming episodes. Oh, this is just a Halloween crossover, but yeah, I would say that overall I did enjoy reading this comic. I thought it was very interesting, and it is immediately intriguing as to where it's going to go and how it's all going to end. That especially, I think that starting with a flash forward is really good for that, kind of creating that sense of anticipation, because we are left with those lingering questions of, well, if there are only two characters shown in the prologue, does that mean that everybody else didn't make it, or are they just somewhere else? Did they live, but maybe they've been left behind somewhere, or maybe they're in a shelter somewhere? We don't know. And, we've kind of got to wait to find out. And I will admit, I didn't think that we would have to wait quite as long, because it's a 38 episode series at this point. And so after the first 5 or 6 episodes of the flash forward, everything else is happening technically in the past, and so we still haven't caught up to that moment yet. But yeah, the anticipation of how we're going to get to that stage and what will be lost along the way definitely does help foster that intrigue and kind of keep you wondering what's going to happen. And there's also just the atmosphere, again, like I had mentioned at the beginning, that it's just very bleak, and even fairly early in the story, a lot of people die very quickly in a way that almost feels inconsequential, which kind of sets the expectation that people are going to die left and right in this story, and it's not necessarily off the table that anybody could go at any moment for any reason. And so I do think that kind of does give you a sense of stakes, which kind of helps to maintain that intrigue and keep it interesting, because we can safely assume that our main character will probably make it at least until the end of the narrative. We don't know. We don't know if anybody's going to survive in the end, but obviously, our main characters, the two of them, will probably make it at least until the end. But anybody else, it's hard to say. I mean, again, they're presumed to die at some point just based on their lack of presence in the opening section, but we don't know for sure if they do or not, or when, and so I did like that quite a bit. Oh, I think one of the panels I wanted to bring up as an example was... I think I already passed it. Oh no, sorry, it's coming up, but... But yeah, I think the world is very interesting, it's very stylish, and all in all, I found it quite fun to read. Oh yeah, it should be in this chapter. Sorry, I brought something up as an example, but I didn't have a link to exactly what I was talking about, and so now I've just been scrolling until I can find it. But I think it was should be this next episode here. There we go. Wasn't registering my like. Unknown error. Webtoon doesn't like me. Ah, yeah, so here we are. This was, I'd mentioned the backgrounds at times don't necessarily sell the verticality, and so this was the panel that I had in mind when I was talking about that, because, for example, here you could see the container is it's meant to be kind of teetering on the edge of falling down a ravine, but it comes off a little bit flat, and so it doesn't really feel like it's over, and it kind of just looks like we're looking at flat ground, and this is what's supposed to be the edge. It almost feels like just a crack in the ground, and so it doesn't really sell that verticality. And there are a few other moments that are a bit like that, where I feel like, I'm not sure if it's just the shading or maybe lack of filtering or something, but I'm sorry, that wasn't supposed to be like a major focal point as far as reviewing goes. It was a minor detail that isn't even a problem in every scene. It's just there were a few panels like this where it really stood out to me, and so I didn't mean to make such a big scene out of it, but yeah, that was something that I just happened to notice. Overall, though, like I said, I think I do actually like this comic quite a bit. I like that it's very, what would be the word? Maybe gritty. It's got a lot of grit to it. It's not afraid to kill off characters and kind of thrust everyone into a situation that can just continually get worse with not even necessarily any light at the end of the tunnel. And I suppose that was one more thing that I was maybe hoping to find out about, though, at least from a world-building perspective, is since the main thrust of our narrative is that our character needs to deliver this package to the fortress, and that is kind of the entire driving motivation of the thing. We don't know why, though, as readers, that's supposed to happen, and so we don't really know the significance of Shun being delivered to the Polaris, and so I think that it would probably help build investment a little bit if we kind of had a better idea of why it was so important. But it also will depend on kind of what the payoff is at the end of the series. It kind of just depends on what the plan is for the series, because it could be that type of story where it doesn't necessarily matter. You know, it's like the box in Pulp Fiction, right? Like, it doesn't really matter what's in it. It's just the thing that causes events to happen. So it could be that type of scenario where maybe it doesn't actually matter why Jean needs to get to the Polaris. It's just the thing that makes the narrative start. And so, yeah, I suppose time will tell. I look forward to finding out, though. At the risk of rambling on any further, though, I think I'm going to call it there because, sorry, my thoughts are not very organized, but I'll go through after this and like the rest of the episodes as well. But yeah, overall, as I said, I think I enjoyed it. It sets an atmosphere that I typically really enjoy in a story, so I think that helped a lot. I did feel like the world building was mostly easy to follow, and I think the information was doled out at a reasonable pace. I suppose from a Webtoon reader standpoint, if I was just to try and speculate, generalize as to how audiences might receive this, I think that maybe it's probably the type of thing that, to get more views on it, it would benefit from maybe being more simplistic and a little more obvious. Because this is a type of, again, it's a little bit of an opaque story where you have, again, characters that are talking in terminology and discussing things, and there's a lot of bureaucracy and whatnot, and it doesn't all get explained right away. It does get explained, it's not right away. And so with Webtoon, where a majority of the popular series are things like I Was Reborn as the Villainess in a romance novel, things like that, where Webtoons in general just tend to be more straightforward. They tend to have stories that are really, really simple, and the whole plot will be in the title of the story in many cases. And so a narrative like this, I think, will probably struggle a little bit more on a platform like this, just because it's surrounded by stories that are so much more simple and so much more accessible. But I don't mean to suggest that the story is made more simple, because I think that the way that this one is written, I don't think it really could be simplified in that style without fundamentally changing what it is. And so I enjoy it for what it is, but I don't know if it's the type of thing that's going to have mass appeal on the Webtoon platform, just because of what the audiences typically read on this site. But I think that it's probably the type of thing that, as it gets further along or reaches completion, because I imagine that this is probably not that long of a story. It seems like it has a clear-cut endpoint with the finishing of the mission. It'll probably gain momentum in terms of readership as it gets closer to that, when the more significant events really start to pile up, because at 37 episodes, we've got quite a few significant things have happened, but it's all building towards something, and so I think that as we get closer to that, that'll probably help, because there will be those really big payoff moments to help build that word of mouth. But overall, I would say it's a pretty good job. Keep it up. I definitely look forward to reading more of it, and I think I've rambled on long enough. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in your nightmares.